So, good evening, everybody. In this video lecture, we are going to talk about Chapter 12. It's about bureaucracy. And again, I have split this into two pieces just to make it a little more easy to digest. So let's go ahead and talk about bureaucracy. So, what's the definition of bureaucracy? Well, it's a complex structure of offices, tasks, and rules and principles of organization used in large-scale institutions to coordinate work. So, our federal and state governments are definitely bureaucracies. The executive branch is a bureaucracy, but the definition itself is broad. Even large business and corporations can be bureaucracy. We just tend to use it with the word government, but it's not the only place that you have bureaucracy. Companies and businesses can have bureaucracies as well. Okay. So it fits all large scale institutions and non-government entities as well as government entities. A bureaucracy is a means of coordinating many different parts of government that work together to provide services. And often at times it's up to the bureaucracy to define what their policy is or what their practice is. So at its best, bureaucracy ensures that fair and accountable administration of these policies and procedures occur. There are some key characteristics of bureaucracy in American government. Okay. First, it is mission driven. Each department tends to have its own mission and it strives to complete its mission with expertise. Many who work in bureaucracies are experts in their area, especially the higher you go within an industry or scientific type of endeavor, the more expertise you will find, probably more education, more experience that they've had. Those individuals tend to be the experts in what they do, and we see them in that hierarchical structure. So bureaucracies function along clear lines of authority using standard operating procedures. Congress delegates significant policy making or the rule-making responsibilities to bureaucracies. Currently, we have the non-delegation doctrine, which is basically the theory that one branch of government must not authorize another entity to exercise power or functions that they're supposed to do. But people are in the legislative branch frequently delegate responsibility to these bureaucracies. And these bureaucracies make their own policies and regulations and rules. Okay. So the people have delegated, obviously, power to Congress, and then Congress is allegedly not supposed to be able to turn around and delegate it to someone else. That's the basis behind this delegation doctrine. But Congress delegates a significant, I would suggest, the majority of policy making to these bureaucracies. So we have, in one sense, this principal agent problem, okay? So you've got this conflict between the priorities of the principal, which is, okay, you've got the priorities of what Congress wants to have done, and they say to these bureaucracies, we're giving you the responsibility to do it. And then the bureaucracy, acting on the behalf of Congress, doesn't always do it the way Congress wants them to do it, which kind of creates this principal agent problem. So there are reasons why Congress delegates this responsibility. They delegate these duties to the bureaucracy. One is these groups, these bureaucracies have people with expertise, realistically. So, I mean, we don't really want Congress making really highly technical decisions that specifically deal with science, for example. No, there's more flexibility and responsiveness in these agencies than Congress has. Congress most likely doesn't know how or what to do with some in these agencies that they've created. So let me give you just a really simple example. Do we want members of Congress determining where to put a pit toilet in a national park in the United States or where to build an interstate? No, we're going to rely on people that are experts in sanitation or somebody that's an engineer that knows how to build a bridge. So the best route is for Congress to give up or delegate that authority to experts. But another reason, sometimes Congress does not want to make a difficult choice or have to make a difficult decision. They want somebody else to do it. So they don't get held responsible. They don't want to be politically unpopular. So there's this unwillingness, political unwillingness to make hard choices. They may want to get something passed, but they don't really want to be held responsible for how that's carried out. So they make it general. Congress makes laws that are general, or they create things for bureaucracies to carry out that are general or vague. So they have to be interpreted by these particular bureaucracies. Okay. And Congress likes to have a scapegoat. If it doesn't go well, they can say to their constituents, look, it wasn't me. It was that bureaucracy that messed it up. They're the ones that are doing it wrong, not us. So it gives them kind of gives them somebody to blame. So they can come back and say, well, that bureaucracy is not doing it the way they want it. It's not the way we set it up. So that's why we see so much of this delegation happening to bureaucracies. I'm not saying bureaucracies are totally innocent, but I am suggesting that Congress makes it vague for a reason. So what do they do? Okay, what do bureaucrats do when we give them these responsibilities? Okay, how do they implement? How do bureaucracies and bureaucrats implement these laws? Okay, so they're going to determine how to translate that law into a specific rule or regulation. Okay, they make the rules, so they're going to issue rules to guide how the law is implemented. So this process of rulemaking is often very political because they are enforcing law. So for example, let me give you an example. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, okay, held Volkswagen, the car maker, accountable because the Volkswagen falsified emission levels because the federal government has set a standard of how much emissions a vehicle can put out, and Volkswagen falsified that information. Okay. And it was the agency that determined that found that out. So there's some accountability there. They also they also innovate. Okay, they devise new ways of doing things and coming up with things. That's really what bureaucracies do. They get the law from Congress, they look at it, figure it out, they make rules and regulations, and they pass those on to we, the citizens, and then they enforce those specific rules and regulations. I'm not sure you've ever asked yourself this, but how do you become a bureaucrat? Okay. So how do you get a job with the government? So people don't generally say, how do I become a bureaucrat? But they can say, how do I get a job with a nuclear agency? Or how do I get a job with the National Park Service? So under the Civil Service Act of 1883, they developed a hiring system. So it's been a long time ago. They developed a hiring system for bureaucracies based upon merit. Are they qualified? Basically is, can you do the job? Do you have the expertise, the knowledge, and the skills to do this position? The merit system requires appointees to these positions that they be objectively qualified, that there are qualifications that these people have to meet. And it's based on, we got to get the most qualified people to do this, the best employees into these positions. So it helps it. When they created the merit system, it got rid of what was called the spoils system, which people got jobs based on who their political buddies were or who their political friends were. So at higher levels of government, jobs are still filled as political appointment, like cabinet secretaries and undersecretaries. But and those people are appointed and they serve at the will of the president. But everybody else is hired and keep their position regardless of who the president is, based on their ability to do the job and an evaluation system. And I think this is an important note. Contrary to public assertions, the federal bureaucracy has not grown at all over the past 35 years. Even though the population of the United States has grown more than 70 million people, the bureaucracy has not grown in the last 35 years. So in the 1980s, there were 3 million civilian employees, 3.6 million military personnel, and in 2019, there were 2.8 million civilian employees and 1.3 million military personnel. So you can see that there has been a reduction in the number of federal workers. Okay. So the ratio of federal employees to the total workforce has declined dramatically over the past 60 years. But the number of, okay, but this is important. However, the number of state and local government employees has grown. Let's look at this chart. It's also in your book, figure 12.2. You can see the drop in federal employees in the last, from 1950 to 2022 is significant. So employees in the workforce has went down, okay? And just as on a percentage of the national workforce, how there have actually been a decrease, and it continue. You see a little bump. Sometimes that's when you get a new president in and they bring in some new policies or whatever. But the country is getting bigger and larger in population, but the number of federal employees is going down. So if people come back and say, "Oh, we've got more federal workers than we've ever had," that's just not accurate. Okay. And if you want to look this up, it's in your book. It's in the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So you are welcome to look these statistics up for yourself. Here's another chart if you want to compare us to other countries. How does the United States compare to other countries as far as the number of national government employees? And you can see we're right in the middle. We're not the most, we're not the least. So in the level of government, there's a lot of positions, more positions in state and local government based on the population than there is in the federal government. Okay, so here's another chart, a lot of charts. Looking at the organization of the executive branch, that's where you're going to see these agencies generally, because the president, remember, is executing or carrying out the laws of Congress. So it's under the office of the administrative branch that these agencies operate under, okay? So there are 15 departments, and there are some smaller ones underneath these, and there's some selected administrative agencies and commissions and government corporations, and those are listed on the bottom. These aren't all of them, but this will kind of give you a good idea of what makes up the federal government. So you got the office of the president, and then you've got cabinet secretaries, and then you're going to have some departments underneath them, and then they go down into some of these other agencies. So these 15 executive departments form what is called the president's cabinet, and they're the largest subunits of the executive branch, and they employ 80% of the federal workforce are under those agencies. The secretaries or heads of these 15 departments, we call them cabinet secretaries, form, along with the vice president and the attorney general's office, the executive branch's cabinet positions. Immediately below each of those secretaries is their deputy secretary or undersecretary, and they form a second tier. And then you get down to these operating agencies, which form the third tier, which is called the bureau level. Okay, so for example, the FBI, which is a third tier, the third level down in the Department of Justice, and it's actually called the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So the bureau level is the third tier. There are also some independent agencies that are set up outside of these departments. An independent agency is not part of the cabinet, and they are also set up and created by Congress. And so outside of that structure, the president can still appoint and direct the heads of these particular agencies. These independent agencies usually have broad powers to provide public services. So, for example, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, Okay. They're not under the president's cabinet, but they are their own independent agency. The Central Intelligence Agency. Okay. So we have these government corporations and regulatory commissions, and then we have these independent agencies. So what's a government corporation? A government corporation is a government agency that performs a market-oriented, say, so money generating service, and it raises its own revenues to fund activities. So, for example, the Postal Service charges money. Another example is interesting is Amtrak. They look like a corporation. They kind of function like a corporation, but they're actually a unit of our federal government. So independent regulatory commissions are rulemaking bodies that are supposed to be insulated from politics. They shouldn't be partisan. They're outside of the executive department. So you have the FCC, okay, Federal Communications Commission, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, okay. So that is the end of part one, and I'll pick you up with part two. Okay, let's start with part two. And if you want to go back and take a look at that chart. Okay, so we're covering bureaucracy. So what are the goals of the federal bureaucracy? What are their goals? What is their purpose? And like it says in the preamble of the Constitution, their job is to take care of the public welfare. We want to make sure that we promote the public welfare. Like I said, it's in the preamble. Various agencies provide services. They build our infrastructure, they enforce regulations. So, for example, we have the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Labor, and so forth. They include the National Park Service, which is responsible that cares for the upkeep of our national parks. We have regulatory agencies that promote the public welfare, such as the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, for example, and they have the force of law when they make decisions and regulations. It is the same; it's law. So bureaucracy also provides services. Some agencies provide services to a specific group of American society. So the Department of Agriculture was basically established a long time ago in 1862 to promote the interests of farmers. The Department of Veterans Administration works with veterans organizations, not just within the Veterans Agency, but within other organizations to try to build, maintain relationships. And they work between agencies, and they kind of work between these bureaucracies, which can kind of create what we've talked about earlier called the iron triangles. So what's an iron triangle? This is important. You're going to need to know this. The interest groups, okay, so you have interest groups or organizations. You have congressional committees with members of Congress, and then you have subcommittees, and they create and I strongly suggest that you look back at section 11 in your book, figure 11, at this iron triangle, okay? When we look at them, we recognize that they are in there, like you patting each other's back or taking care of each other, okay? But there's a concept that we need to talk about here, and it's called regulatory capture, okay? Regulatory capture. This is when the agency, so, the EPA or whatever agency that is, becomes more concerned about keeping an interest group happy than they are with regulating them. This is not a good situation. We want these agencies to make sure that they're keeping track of those groups and industries and that they're following the law, that they're not bending the rules, so that they're doing what they were tasked to do for all of us. So, for example, the Boeing Max 737 jet, okay? Well, basically these 737 jets were flying themselves into the ground, crashing. Then they couldn't figure out what the problem was. Well, part of the problem was this regulatory capture. The FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, allowed the industry, the airline industry at that point, to basically check itself. They weren't being checked for safety precautions. And as a result, there were problems with that particular aircraft that were overlooked. It caused, wow, multitude of crashes. And they eventually had to ground the entire 737 MAX fleet until they finally figured out what the problem was with the aircraft. The newest agency is the Department of Homeland Security, which was created in 2002 as a direct result of a high priority that was placed on domestic security after 9/11. So the Department of Homeland Security has a lot of power. It has the power to detain terrorist suspects, engage in extensive domestic intelligence, which is can be concerning for people. It also is responsible for food security so that people don't poison intentionally food, for example. There's a lot of natural disasters that come under there, border security, science related concerns like people putting anthrax in envelopes. That's going to go, that would be investigated by Homeland Security, nuclear threats. So the Department of Homeland Security is basically kind of a catch-all for protecting the security of the country. The Department of State and the Department of Defense are also very important in maintaining our national security. The State Department primary mission is diplomacy with other countries. It also staffs our U.S. embassies, and the Department of Defense provides military forces to deter war and protect the nation. So when we talk about national security and democracy, we recognize that there's conflict. Okay. Well, when you have people who value liberty and freedom and they're what we consider our individual rights and privacy, then you're going to have some of these departments that we feel like infringe on those particular protections. They're controversial in a democracy, and there's a trade-off between respecting personal rights and protecting the general public. So safety versus security, or safety versus privacy. So you're aware how the TSA came about. So after 9/11, there was really no TSA. Anybody could walk right up to the gates at an airport, not go through screening, not be searched, not have to be X-rayed or whatever they do. Okay, there was really no security you went through. Well, as everybody that's ever flown knows, it's very different. So what really happened was, at the time, the American public demanded that the government keep them safe. And I will tell you, Americans wanted to feel safe. And not only did they want to be safe on a plane, they weren't sure that planes were not being used as a weapon to take out, which a plane did hit the Pentagon, and there was a plane that was directed at the Capitol building. So there was a really strong response about not only can people die on planes, but they can be used as a weapon. So Congress responded to those demands and were very restrictive on what people would have considered a personal right to privacy. Okay. But in an effort to try to make the country happy and protection, they created the restrictions we see with the TSA. Okay. Well, as 9/11 gets further in the rearview mirror and people don't remember, or they have no idea what it was like, they forget the horror of 9/11. That perception of the threat no longer exists. So a lot of Americans say, well, we don't think we should have to go through that kind of screening anymore. It's not convenient. It's too intrusive. It's ineffective. It's poorly managed. So there's just kind of a need for secrecy or a need for privacy versus safety. There's also secrecy when it comes to what should the government tell people is happening versus what should be about national security and what the people have the right to know is happening with their government. So what do we need to know? What needs to be kept secret? That's tough. There's no doubt that some things need to be kept secret. Very few people need to know specifics related to national security, but there is some other information that's not secret. And some claim that we have overused this. This is classified, or this is meets a certain classification issue, and then that's been carried way too extreme. Today, we also want to maintain a strong economy. So the government does not necessarily directly run the economy. However, it is very, as you probably understand now, it is very, very responsible for what happens to our economy. And as you learned in the presidency section, that is the number one issue that affects elections. It's the economy. Okay. So the government's ability to tax, to as you should know, implement tariffs, monetary and spending powers manipulates the economy. So the way that the government is involved very much affects the economy. Okay. Another way is the IRS enforces tax laws and serves as a revenue agency. It collects taxes that we pay. And it's important that we have an agency with experts that collects taxes because honestly, people don't want to pay taxes. If it were honestly just left up to people and they'd say, pay what you feel is right, I'm not sure very many people would actually pay what would be considered a fair or equal share of taxes. The Federal Reserve is a major monetary agency. It has authority over interest rates and lending activity at the federal level. So this is interesting. Every night, some banks have surplus money and some need to borrow money. So the Federal Reserve determines the lending rate between these banks. So if one bank is lending money, another bank is borrowing money, they determine at what rate that they're going to borrow, which in turn influences the rates that they charge us if we're borrowing money. So if these banks are borrowing money at a rate, that affects us down here borrowing money at a certain rate. And all of this affects the economy. It's either easier to borrow, it makes things more expensive, it can make things cheaper. The harder it is to borrow, sometimes we know the harder it is to borrow, the higher the interest rate, the more expensive something is. So we look at bureaucracy, and one of the complaints that we have is there's just way too much red tape. It's always slow. There's way too many rules. It's costly to taxpayers, and overall, bureaucracies are just horrible. Okay. Well, there's an interesting book by a scholar, and his comment is, for the most part, really government works fine. It's like a car. This is a really interesting analogy. It's like a car that you get in and you turn the key and the car drives and you get to work or wherever or school or wherever you need to go. You don't even think about the hundreds or thousands of pieces of equipment and parts that are all working to get you from your house to your job or your house to school or wherever your car is transporting you to. That's kind of how the government works too. You don't necessarily think about all of those different parts that keep everything running. But when something goes wrong and the car doesn't start or it doesn't run, it doesn't drive. Well, we complain about government, but it's kind of like that car. So when things in the government aren't working well, we complain and we say, oh, the government's horrible, it's terrible. And we complain it's wasteful, that they have poor service. So you can kind of get an idea that it may not seem like a big deal, but there's a lot of moving parts behind it, scenes that we're not aware of. Efforts have been made to improve government performance, efficiency. We've been reinventing bureaucratic procedures. Every president comes into office and they try to readdress how government procedures and policies actually function. And they do something called termination, evolution, and privatization. Okay, we're going to cover those. But Democrats generally try to make existing bureaucratic agencies more effective. Republicans have a desire to try to privatize more government work. So what's termination? Termination is about reducing the size of bureaucracy. And to do that, we have to eliminate programs. Okay, programs have to be removed. But it's rare. Well, it used to be rare. Even under Republican presidents, it used to be rare. But many Americans benefit from government services. Many. And they tend to fiercely defend this agency that they think matters to them or is important to in their life, which makes it really difficult to terminate programs because somebody somewhere is benefiting or working for or involved in that program for some reason. And I'm going to say it, Americans are notorious for complaining about government and taxes or whatever, but they will fight to the end to keep the services that they need or that their family needs or for whatever it is they personally support. So we want it all, and we'll fight to keep those services coming, but we don't have a tendency to want to pay for it. So what's devolution? It involves delegating programs from the federal level, so devolving it down to the state and local level, okay? So devolution has critics. They point out that state governments cannot run a deficit. So many states require that they have a balanced budget. The federal government runs a deficit, as you've probably heard, pretty much all the time. But state governments, usually by state constitution, cannot run a deficit, which tends to lead to cuts in programs, especially for people who are poor or low income. Proponents of devolution counter, it helps improve government efficiency, flexibility, innovation, keeps it closer to the people. It does allow states to be creative and do what they want to do and how they do it. However, if the federal government's doing it or the state government's doing it, you pay or you pay. I think there's this idea that if they do devolution, that it's not going to cost as much. It's going to cost, and it's still going to be taxes. It's just depending on who's doing them, okay? With devolution, what the federal government can come back and do is make it an unfunded mandate, saying, the state, you have to do this, but we're not going to give you any federal money anymore. So then we as a state have to pick that up anyway, okay? So that's not always a good thing either. Privatization involves a formerly public service now being provided by a private company, and so the government and is paid for by the government, but it's carried out by private companies, and they say, well, it's more efficient if a private company does it. Okay, so we're basically contracting it out or turning it completely over to a private company, and then people still have to pay. Okay, notice what I said. You still pay. It's not like all of a sudden something's going to be not having any costs, okay? So we take something the government used to do and we contract it out to a private entity, okay? So it may downsize the number of government workers, but other workers are going to have to pick up that slack. They may no longer be part of a government bureaucracy. They'll be part of a company or a corporation bureaucracy. So government size goes down, but the money is still being spent. So I just think this is kind of a sleight of hand, okay? This is a sleight of hand. We can say, well, government is smaller. Well, really what we're saying is the number of federal employees is less, but the money is still being spent. So it doesn't change the amount of money, okay? It's just going to be sent or spent to a private company to do what the government employees were doing previously. So the primary aim of privatization is to reduce the cost of government, which may or may not reduce the cost to everybody else, okay? But there's definitely concerns about accountability. It's one thing to hold the bureaucracy, government officials accountable, because you can talk to elected officials if you are not getting satisfaction from a government agency, you can get a hold of an elected official or whatever. Not the same if you go to a private industry. It's really difficult to hold those people responsible, okay? So in a private company, there may be one person that's responsible, and you may have a government person trying to make sure that that company or corporation is keeping up their contract the way it's supposed to be done. So there's been some recent efforts for its administrative reform. I don't know how recent I would consider this, but President George W. Bush promoted the concept of selected skilled subordinates, okay, and a delegated responsibility. And then President Obama emphasized scientific expertise. He said we wanted the best people with the best skills. President Trump was and has been distrustful of what he called the deep state and scientific of expertise, and he has worked quite diligently to minimize both. And in the last chapter on Congress, we talked about the bureaucracies and how Congress should be overseeing these bureaucracies. Let's look at it from the bureaucrat side, okay? Oversight, which is supposed to be done by Congress, is an effort to exercise control over these agencies, over these executive agencies. And they do this through having them come in and talk to in hearings. They have investigations and some other techniques. Okay. There was a general accounting office. There was a congressional research service. There was a congressional budget office that was supposed to provide important information. We had these inspector general offices that were supposed to make sure that these agencies were following the law, handling the money appropriately. These experts were supposed to be making sure that these agencies were following appropriate policies and procedures in the will of Congress. Other forms of oversight of the bureaucracy can be judicial. So federal courts can judge. They're called special courts, and we're going to get into that in the next chapter. But there are special courts that look at the constitutionality of these bureaucratic agencies and these policies and procedures. They can settle disputes between Congress and the agencies. They can monitor the implementation of laws. This is all the courts. And then there's internal oversight within these agencies. And then whistleblowers can report wrongdoing within their own agencies. There's a whistleblower protection law. So you have citizen oversight under the Freedom of Information Act. So you can actually request information from the federal government under the Freedom of Information Act. So in 2014, I know this is older, but this is just an example. In 2014, there were 714,000 Freedom of Information Act requests, okay, which was an increase of almost 556,000 from just 5 years earlier. So there's been an 80% growth from 2012 to 2018 in the number of Freedom of Information Acts. 80% growth in that 6-year period. So there's a backlog in these requests, and people are asking for information, and the more they're asked, the longer it takes. But the Freedom of Information Act requests are funded. I mean, it's another funding from the federal government. Okay. Sometimes, unfortunately, when this information comes out, so much of it is redacted. We don't even know we don't even necessarily get the information we're looking for. About 9% of these requests were denied in 2014. So not a lot. Okay. Anyway, so those are some interesting facts about bureaucracies, and that basically ends our chapter on bureaucracies.